Before the abandoned mine, the secret affair, and the accusation that would later stun a courtroom, Erin Corwin was a shy teenager who could tame a wild horse but struggled to find her place far from home. Erin was born in Tennessee on July 15, 1994. She was only a few weeks old when a deeply religious couple from Oak Ridge adopted her. They already had 2 biological children, and they would eventually adopt 4 more, including Erin. It was a large household, busy, close-knit, and centered on family and church. Erin was quiet by nature. She got along with her brothers and sisters, but she seemed most comfortable around animals. That was where her confidence showed. Her parents said she trained the family cat to follow commands. As a child, she even managed to tame a wild horse. Think about that contrast. Around people, Erin could be reserved. Around an animal that most adults would hesitate to approach, she somehow knew how to build trust. At 14, she began working part-time at a veterinary clinic. For a while, it looked as though she might turn that connection with animals into a career. But Erin eventually realized veterinary medicine came with a part she could not easily handle. Seeing animals sick, injured, or suffering affected her too deeply. She cared too much to detach herself from it. As a teenager, Erin grew close to a boy named Jonathan Corwin. They had known each other for years before Jonathan asked Erin's father for permission to date her when she was 16. Their relationship continued through high school. After graduation, Jonathan proposed. Jonathan was serving in the United States Marines, and when he was transferred to the base at Twentynine Palms, California, Erin went with him. She was 19 years old. Until then, Erin had never lived away from her parents. Now she was on the other side of the country, in a landscape that could hardly have felt more different from home. Twentynine Palms sat beside vast stretches of Mojave Desert. The heat could be brutal. Towns and services were spread far apart, and employment options near the base were limited. For Erin, this was supposed to be the beginning of adult life. But it was also deeply isolating. She found one place that made sense to her. About half an hour away was a horse rescue ranch, and Erin began volunteering there regularly. She and Jonathan also brought animals into their own home, 2 dogs and a cat. Their apartment complex was filled with other Marines, their spouses, and their children. The couple spent time together and formed a small social circle. From the outside, Erin and Jonathan appeared to be settling in. They had their pets, their neighbors, and the beginnings of a life of their own. Then, in January 2014, Erin learned she was pregnant. She and Jonathan were overjoyed. But the pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and the loss hit Erin hard. People around her noticed that she became more withdrawn and depressed. She pulled away from Jonathan and from others in their circle. Online shopping became a temporary escape. For a little while, buying things made her feel better. But Erin was not working. The couple depended on Jonathan's military income, and money was already tight. Credit card debt began accumulating, adding another source of pressure to a marriage that was already struggling. Eventually, Jonathan took away Erin's bank cards. Whatever his intention, Erin felt trapped and powerless inside her own home. And while that distance was growing between her and her husband, she was spending more time with another Marine in their apartment community. His name was Christopher Brandon Lee. Christopher shared Erin's interest in horses and began accompanying her to the rescue ranch. But both of them were married. Christopher's wife, Nicole Lee, lived in the same close military community, and they had a young daughter named Liberty. That matters because this was not a place where private lives stayed private for long. These families lived near one another. The Marines worked together. Their spouses socialized together. Erin and Christopher's affair was taking place inside a circle where nearly everyone knew everyone else. Nicole discovered the relationship and told Jonathan. Jonathan did not immediately end his marriage. He chose to try to preserve it. The affair appeared to stop, at least for a while. Then Erin and Christopher began seeing each other again, this time with more care. Erin confided in her best friend back home, Jessie, through private messages. She told Jessie that she wanted to leave Jonathan and move to Alaska, Christopher's home state. By the summer of 2014, Erin believed she had found a possible route out of a marriage in crisis. But that route depended on a man who already had a wife, a daughter, and a military career to protect. In late June, shortly before her 20th birthday and a planned visit from her mother, Erin discovered she was approximately 3 months pregnant. She believed the baby might be Christopher's, and she believed the pregnancy might finally force a decision about her future. Christopher's response was not to make that future public. It was to ask Erin to keep the pregnancy secret. On June 28th, Erin told Jonathan she was scouting places in Joshua Tree National Park to visit with her mother. She promised to be home around 4 that afternoon. At first, there was nothing especially alarming about the plan. Erin's mother was due to arrive in California soon, and Erin had been looking forward to the visit. She wanted to find a few places they could explore together. So that morning, she got into her car, left the apartment near the Marine base, and headed toward the desert. But there was something Jonathan now knew that had changed the atmosphere inside their home. A few days earlier, Erin had begun feeling unwell. Jonathan took her to the hospital, and during that visit, doctors confirmed, in front of both of them, that she was pregnant. Erin was already roughly 3 months along. For Jonathan, that should have been happy news. He and Erin had been devastated by her earlier miscarriage. But this pregnancy came with a question he may not even have realized he needed to ask. Because Christopher Lee had reportedly been told something different. According to people Erin had confided in, she had warned Christopher that the unborn baby might be his. Christopher was married. He had a daughter. And if Erin's pregnancy exposed their relationship, the consequences could spread through 2 marriages, 2 families, and a close-knit military community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. That tension was sitting beneath the surface when Erin drove away. 4 o'clock came. She did not return. Jonathan tried calling her, but Erin's phone was switched off. More time passed. Evening settled over the desert, and then the entire night went by without any sign of her. Erin did not call. She did not send a message. She did not come home. Jonathan contacted police the following morning. At that stage, officers had no reason to assume they were dealing with a murder. The immediate concern was far simpler, and urgent enough on its own. Erin had said she was heading into an enormous stretch of unforgiving terrain during the summer. She could have taken a wrong road. Her car might have broken down. She could have become stranded without water, suffered an injury, or wandered away from her vehicle trying to find help. In the Mojave heat, those were not minor possibilities. They were life-threatening. Police began treating the case as a potential rescue. Officers went out to search the national park and the surrounding desert, while investigators stayed behind to question the people closest to Erin. They needed to know where she might have gone, what she had taken with her, and whether she had mentioned any specific destination. But one detail immediately bothered them. Why had Jonathan waited through the night? His wife had promised to return around 4. Her phone was off. She was alone in extreme heat, somewhere in a vast desert landscape. Yet the missing person report did not come until the next morning. Every lost hour reduced the chance of finding Erin alive if she was injured or dehydrated. Now, a delayed report does not prove guilt. People panic differently. Some wait because they expect a simple explanation: a dead battery, poor reception, a change of plans. But detectives could not ignore it. Jonathan became one of the first people they had to examine closely. Then a friend and neighbor named Isling gave them a reason to look at the marriage in an entirely different way. She told investigators that Erin had been having an affair with Christopher, another Marine who lived nearby. The relationship had reportedly begun earlier that year, during a period when Erin was grieving her miscarriage and becoming increasingly withdrawn. Christopher often accompanied her to the horse rescue ranch. He was also married and had a young daughter. And Christopher's wife had already discovered the affair. She told Jonathan. Jonathan chose not to end his marriage and instead tried to repair it. But investigators now had to wonder what he truly knew by June 28th. Had he learned that Erin and Christopher might still be involved? Had the hospital's confirmation of the pregnancy made him question whether the baby was his? Suddenly, the delay in calling police looked more troubling. But it also opened a second path. When investigators first spoke to Christopher, he minimized his connection to Erin. He claimed he barely knew her, that their relationship amounted to little more than occasional greetings around the neighborhood. That was difficult to reconcile with what Isling had told them. There was, to be fair, an innocent reason for Christopher to hide an affair. Adultery could carry serious personal and military consequences. His marriage, access to his daughter, reputation, and career could all be placed at risk. Lying about Erin did not automatically mean he had harmed her. Still, it meant detectives could not trust his story. They were now looking at two unsettling possibilities: a husband who might have discovered that his wife was carrying another man's child, and a married lover who may have feared that the pregnancy would expose everything. The search was no longer simply about a woman lost in the desert. Investigators had uncovered two strained marriages, a concealed affair, and a pregnancy that could threaten every adult involved. Then Erin's car appeared in an empty stretch outside town. Her footprints led away from it and stopped beside another vehicle's tire tracks. Erin had not simply vanished from her car. The scene suggested that she had walked to another vehicle willingly, and her private messages indicated that she knew exactly who she expected to find there. Her car was discovered in a desolate area on the outskirts of town, far from the ordinary routes around the base. There was no sign of Erin inside, no obvious struggle, no immediate explanation for why she would leave the vehicle in the middle of such an empty landscape. But the absence of a struggle did not make the scene harmless. It made it more complicated. Investigators had to treat the car, the ground around it, and every object nearby as potential evidence. In a place like the Mojave, wind and heat could destroy a fragile clue before anyone even realized it was there. So the first priority was preservation.
As a potential criminal investigation, so we don't want to destroy any evidence that we may be able to recover.
Christopher's account did not collapse all at once. It shifted in small pieces, each new version appearing only after detectives showed him another fact he could no longer deny. At first, he insisted he barely knew Erin. There had been no physical relationship, he said, and no arrangement to see her on June 28th. He had simply driven into the desert to hunt coyotes. That trip came with its own increasingly strange story. Christopher claimed he never found any coyotes and became lost. Then, at some point, he supposedly saw a man in the distance pointing a gun at him. Christopher said he fired several shots toward the stranger and drove away. Think about that for a second. An armed confrontation in the middle of the Mojave. Shots fired. And Christopher had never reported it. When detectives asked why, he said he had been outside cell coverage. But investigators already knew he had deliberately switched his phone to airplane mode. Those are not the same thing. One means the network cannot reach you. The other means you have chosen to disconnect from it. And during that explanation, Christopher reportedly slipped. He referred to himself as part of a "we," even though he had repeatedly insisted he had been alone. Maybe it was nothing, a verbal mistake. But in an interview already crowded with contradictions, detectives noticed. They also confronted him with the tire impressions found beside Erin's abandoned car. Those impressions appeared very similar to the tires on the vehicle Christopher had driven into the desert. The comparison was not conclusive enough to establish a perfect match, but it was close enough to demand an explanation. Christopher still denied meeting Erin. Then the story moved again. He admitted that he had seen Erin's car that day, but claimed Erin had not been inside it. When detectives asked why he had concealed that detail, Christopher said he feared people would assume he and Erin had resumed their affair. But investigators already had messages from Erin to her best friend, Jesse. Those messages indicated that the affair had resumed. More importantly, Erin had told Jesse that she expected to meet Christopher in the desert that morning to discuss their relationship and her pregnancy. Christopher's answer was not to explain the messages. It was to attack Erin's credibility. He claimed she had lied to Jesse and described Erin as a pathological liar. He also asserted that Erin had falsely told people Jonathan hit her. That was Christopher's allegation, not an established fact. And detectives had no reason to treat his characterization of Erin as proof. It looked less like an answer than an attempt to make every piece of evidence disappear by blaming the woman who could no longer explain it herself. Still, suspicion was not enough for a murder arrest. Christopher agreed to provide fingerprints and a DNA sample, then walked free. A warrant allowed investigators to search his home. They found no direct evidence there proving what had happened to Erin. But they did discover that the rifle Christopher had carried into the desert was missing. Nickel had taken it to the horse ranch where Christopher and Erin had spent time. Detectives went there with her and recovered the weapon from inside the ranch owner's house. The owner, however, said she had not known Nickel had entered the home and left the rifle there. Another unexplained choice. Another object moved after Erin vanished. The search also uncovered a homemade gas-powered device, a potato cannon. Investigators considered it illegal under California law, giving them grounds to arrest Christopher on an unrelated charge. It bought them time, but not much. A potato cannon could not substitute for evidence in Erin's disappearance. Nickel posted bail, and Christopher was released. That same week, his military contract ended. He left Nickel and their daughter, Liberty, and returned to Alaska, thousands of miles from the investigation. Jonathan, meanwhile, remained on the base. His superiors temporarily reassigned him to warehouse duty because they were concerned about what the case might do to his mental state. And despite investigators finding no evidence that he had left the base on the day Erin disappeared, public suspicion initially remained fixed on him. To many people watching from outside, the husband still seemed like the obvious suspect. Inside the investigation, the picture was moving in the opposite direction. Christopher had not confessed. The search of his home had not revealed Erin's location. But with every interview, his original claim, that he barely knew Erin and had never seen her that day, became harder to sustain. Detectives were left with a propane tank, a reference to blowing up a mine, and a suspect now living thousands of miles away. Somewhere in the desert were hundreds of shafts, and any one of them could have held the answer. Searching the Mojave was not like searching a neighborhood. The possible hiding places were vertical, unstable, difficult to reach, and scattered across miles of terrain that could endanger the searchers themselves. And with every day that passed, the purpose of the operation was changing. What had begun as an urgent effort to bring Erin home alive was slowly becoming something else. More than a week had passed. Christopher had left California and returned to Alaska after his military contract ended. The odds of finding Erin alive were fading fast. Investigators now had a working theory. Christopher had told a fellow Marine that he planned to blow up an abandoned mine shaft on the morning Erin vanished. A propane tank had been seen in his vehicle before he entered the desert, then disappeared by the time he returned. That sounded like a lead, but it was not a location. Abandoned mines were everywhere across that part of the Mojave. Some were marked, many were not. Openings could be hidden by rock, brush, or years of erosion. Others were difficult to reach even with specialized vehicles. And getting to a shaft was only the beginning. The ground around it could collapse. The structure below could be unstable. The air inside might contain toxic or explosive gases. You could stand at the entrance to the right mine and still have no safe way to find out what was at the bottom. Even so, rescue personnel and volunteers went out day after day. They searched in punishing heat, moving through remote stretches of desert and checking one possible site after another. Some slept in their vehicles rather than lose hours driving back to town and returning the next morning. Weeks passed that way. Hundreds of shafts were examined. Erin was not in any of them. Meanwhile, detectives continued tightening the case outside the desert. Jonathan had initially remained under suspicion, partly because of the delay in reporting Erin missing and partly because investigators could not ignore the strain inside the marriage. But they eventually found no evidence that he had left the military base on June 28th. With his movements accounted for, Jonathan was eliminated as a suspect. Once that became public, the media focus shifted. Reporters began discussing law enforcement's interest in Christopher, and people who had previously stayed quiet started coming forward. One of Christopher's fellow Marines remembered a disturbing conversation from before Erin disappeared. Christopher, he said, had discussed how someone might conceal a human body so completely that it would never be found. Then another acquaintance gave detectives something more practical. Only days before Erin vanished, he had gone into the desert with Christopher to explore abandoned mine shafts. Better still, photographs had been taken during that trip. Investigators showed those images to a local expert who knew the mines. He studied the terrain, the rock formations, and what could be seen around the openings. From those clues, he identified several areas where the photographs might have been taken. It narrowed the map. Just not enough. The photographs did not point to one shaft. They pointed to multiple possible locations, each surrounded by still more mines. Search teams now had better places to look, but they still faced hundreds of dangerous openings. Some could be inspected quickly. Others required ropes, breathing equipment, cameras, or specialists. By August, the operation had consumed weeks of manpower and resources. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department finally announced that the large-scale search could not continue indefinitely. It would end after August 16th. That deadline changed everything. Without Erin, investigators might never be able to establish exactly what had happened to her. They had suspicious statements, witness accounts, tire tracks, and Christopher's constantly shifting stories. But suspicion was not a body. And without proof that Erin had been killed, building a murder case would be far more difficult. August 16th arrived, the final scheduled day. A member of the search team was checking yet another section of desert when he approached another abandoned shaft. At first glance, it was one more hole among countless others. Then he noticed the smell. Gas was rising from inside. Mixed with it was another odor, one associated with decomposition. The team could not simply send someone down. They assembled a makeshift device using a camera and battery, then tried lowering it through the opening. But the shaft did not drop straight to the bottom. It descended at an angle, with the lowest point hidden off to one side. The camera could not reach far enough to provide a clear view. A volunteer went in wearing oxygen equipment. At roughly 20 feet, his gas alarms began sounding. The air was dangerous, and he said he could smell the gas even through his mask. Going farther without better equipment was not worth the risk. Before climbing out, however, he lowered the camera down the internal slope. The image was poor, uncertain, but it appeared to show a human body. Nearby were what looked like a white propane tank and a tire. A specialist with more advanced equipment was called to the site. He descended farther and obtained a clearer view. There were human remains below. The fire department then began the difficult recovery operation. Reaching the bottom safely, securing the remains, and bringing them back through the unstable shaft took careful work. But eventually, the recovery was completed. Dental records would confirm what everyone feared. On the day the search was supposed to end, investigators had finally found Erin inside an abandoned mine. The location validated the theory that had driven them through the Mojave for weeks. But the mine did not contain only Erin. Beside her were objects that echoed Christopher's movements before and after June 28th, and one device that pointed to how carefully someone had prepared. The desert had damaged much of the evidence, but it had not erased the pattern: a propane tank, climbing rope, shell casings, and a homemade device designed for strangulation. By the time firefighters recovered the body from the abandoned mine shaft, visual identification was impossible. Investigators had spent weeks looking for Erin, but finding her did not bring the kind of relief anyone had wanted. Dental records confirmed that the young woman inside the shaft was Erin Corwin. The condition of her remains also limited what the medical examiner could determine. There was no single, definitive cause of death. Erin had suffered multiple fractures, and some of them may have happened when her body fell into the shaft. One injury, however, was harder to explain that way. The back of her skull had been fractured in a manner consistent with a blow to the head. Then there was the rope. It was still around Erin's neck, with handles tied to both ends. Investigators described it as a homemade garrote, a device constructed for strangulation. The medical examiner could not conclusively say that strangulation had killed her, but the object's position made that possibility impossible to ignore. And Erin had not been placed in that mine alone. Nearby, searchers recovered the white propane tank seen through the camera. They also found spent shell casings, blue climbing rope, a piece of rebar, a tire, and 2 mugs marked as property of the United States government. There was also a stick with a rag wrapped around one end. It resembled a homemade torch, but it had never been lit. Taken together, those objects suggested more than an attempt to hide a body. Prosecutors would later argue that someone had planned to release or ignite the propane, possibly using the torch to destroy Erin's remains and any evidence surrounding her. Whatever had been intended, it had apparently failed. The gas remained trapped inside the shaft, creating the dangerous conditions that nearly prevented searchers from reaching her. And the evidence the killer may have wanted erased was still there. Other pieces were missing. Erin's purse was never recovered. Neither were her phone, shoes, keys, or wedding ring. Investigators believe those belongings may have been discarded somewhere else, leaving another trail in the desert that was never found. But before detectives could publicly announce any of this, they had a more immediate problem. Christopher Lee was in Alaska. If he learned that Erin had been found, he could run. So the discovery was kept confidential. Investigators told Erin's parents the truth, then asked them to do something almost unimaginably difficult: to remain silent. They could not publicly say that their daughter had been recovered. They could not explain what police had found. Not until Christopher was safely in custody. Law enforcement in California coordinated with authorities in Alaska. Christopher was arrested there and then extradited back to California to face the case that had been forming around him since June 28th. And now, The lies were joined by physical evidence. The white propane tank recovered beside Erin matched the description of the tank witnesses had seen in Christopher's vehicle on the day she vanished. Investigators found the same type of blue climbing rope inside his vehicle. More disturbing still, beneath the passenger seat, they discovered another homemade garrote. It resembled the device recovered with Erin in the mine. Think about how much that changed the case. Before the discovery, detectives had suspicious messages, shifting statements, witness accounts, tire tracks, and Christopher's unexplained hours in the desert. They knew he had lied about his relationship with Erin. They knew he had concealed seeing her car. They knew he had taken propane into an area filled with abandoned shafts. But suspicion, even overwhelming suspicion, is not the same as a prosecutable murder case. The mine connected those separate pieces. It gave investigators Erin's remains, a possible murder weapon, and objects that could be compared with items Christopher possessed. Later, forensic testing strengthened that connection even further. Christopher's DNA was identified on 2 items recovered from inside the shaft. Still, he denied killing Erin. He maintained that denial despite the physical evidence, Erin's messages, the witnesses who placed the propane tank in his vehicle, and the contradictions in his own accounts. The question was no longer whether Christopher had been dishonest. That much was obvious. The question was whether prosecutors could prove that Erin's death had been planned. For nearly 2 years, Erin's family waited while the 2 sides prepared radically different explanations for what had happened in the Mojave. The prosecution saw preparation, a private meeting, a garrote, propane, a remote mine, and an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. The defense would have to create reasonable doubt around that pattern. The trial finally began in October 2016. Prosecutors expected Christopher to continue insisting that he was innocent. Instead, on October 27th, he stood before the jury and announced that he could no longer keep the truth secret. Christopher's confession did not ask the jury to believe he was innocent. It asked them to believe that nearly every sign of preparation, including the garrote in his pocket, was a coincidence. His trial began in October 2016. For more than 2 years, Christopher Lee had insisted that he had nothing to do with Erin Corwin's death. But the prosecution now had Erin's messages, witness testimony, and a timeline that placed Christopher in the desert on the morning she vanished. They had his phone switching to airplane mode, the propane tank seen in his vehicle, then found inside the mine. Blue climbing rope, matching rope recovered from his truck. A homemade garrote beneath his passenger seat that resembled the one found around Erin's neck. And after further testing, investigators found Christopher's DNA on 2 items recovered from the shaft. Piece by piece, the prosecution argued that this was not a spontaneous encounter. It was an appointment disguised as a surprise. Even then, everyone expected Christopher to keep denying it. Instead, on October 27th, he took the witness stand and said he needed to tell the truth because he could no longer carry the secret. He described Erin talking about moving to Alaska and becoming part of his daughter Liberty's life. Christopher said he told Erin she had no right to claim that she loved his child. Then he brought up a suspicion that his wife, Nicole, had previously voiced, one he claimed he had not believed at the time. What followed changed the entire atmosphere in the courtroom.
To tell the truth, I couldn't live with myself if I kept this a secret any longer. We started having a conversation about plans. She wanted to come to Alaska. She wanted to be part of Liberty's life. I told her, I didn't want that. Told her, I decided that, you can't be part of Liberty's life. And she said that she wanted to, that she loved Liberty, and I told her, it's not your choice, it's not your daughter, you don't get to love her, she's mine.
What were you thinking at that point?
I was thinking there's no reason for Erin to love Liberty. She was not hers, she shouldn't have any kind of emotional attachment to her. She thought maybe Erin had molested Liberty because she was uncomfortable with the way she was around her when she had been watching her.
What was your reaction to that?
I felt so safe in my little community that I didn't think it was possible.
So you didn't believe Nicole?
No, not at the time. When Erin told me she loved Liberty and that she wanted to be with her, something clicked. It turned a gear in my head, and I said, why do you care about Liberty so much? Why do you want to be part of her life? And Erin told me, I just love her. And I stood up and I stopped her and I said, did you touch Liberty? And she reeled back a little bit and started starting over her words. And she was saying, you know, I. And I stopped her again. And I yelled at her this time. I said, "Did you molest my daughter?" And she said, "Yes, but," and that was the last thing I heard.